Hello, everyone. My name is Jaroslav Valuch. I'm from the organization called Transitions. Transitions is a media development organization, and one of the fields that we cover intensively for a couple of years already is the counter strategies to disinformation. We do trainings for journalists, we do training for journalism students, fact checkers, and other actors. And we also do news literacy programs with a special target on elderly audiences. And one of the other topics that we cover is the so-called solutions journalism. And we decided that in relation to the COVID infodemic, we would like to integrate all these expertise and practices that we are already experienced with in transitions, and that we would like to integrate it into a course where we explore the possibilities of all these approaches and aspects in really building more resilient communities for the future infodemics and disinformation. So this is the reason why we run this course. So welcome again here. Uh, just a couple of technical points before we move to our dear guest speaker today. This is a first event in a row. This is a first webinar when we meet live, but it's only part of a bigger course. So you are all more than welcome to join us for the whole course. There will be more live sessions in the upcoming days and weeks, and then there will be practical hands-on workshops with us where you will be able to practice some of the learnings from our guest speakers, and when you will have an opportunity to be kind of mentored during these exercises. Another important information is that these webinars are going to be recorded and later on, or as soon as possible, will be translated and subtitled into the languages of the countries for which this course is designed for. So it's going to be the languages. The languages will be Russian, Romanian or Moldovan, and Bosnian. Uh, this course is primarily focused on people from countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and others. But we have some people who are outside of these regions, and you are more than welcome to be here with us and stay with us for the whole course. Just keep in mind that especially the examples and practices that we will be testing or developing in the upcoming workshops will be kind of close to the regions, right? So we'll be using case studies from these regions that I just mentioned. But it's okay. I think for practicing these skills, that doesn't really matter where the examples are coming from. We will have probably around 60 minutes long session today. Uh, what will happen? You will get to meet our dear guest, John Cook, who's the co-author of probably the best handbooks I found or I'm using actively on disinformation and conspiracy theories. So John, he will be sharing some of his tips and ideas from these handbooks in today's session. We will have about 20 minutes presentation of the debunking handbook. Then we'll have uh, approximately 10 minutes for Q&As. So feel free to ask any questions that you might have. And then we will follow up with probably 20-minute session on the conspiracy theory handbook, again with John. And then we'll have Q&A sessions. And at the very end, I will give you some more information about what's gonna happen after this initial webinar. Me, myself, at this moment, I'm the facilitator of the event, but we'll get to meet each other on some of the following workshops, and I'll be sharing also with you some of my experiences and insights into how we can use news literacy to make more disinformation resilient communities. So please welcome John, and John, please share with us your background and then share with us your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I'll share my slides in a minute, but I can give you a brief introduction to myself if you like. I'm based at George Mason University in the US. My research focuses on countering misinformation But specifically, I'm at the Center for Climate Change Communication. So I've been focusing for the last decade on researching misinformation about climate change. What my research has taken me towards is how critical thinking and explaining the rhetorical techniques in misinformation is a particularly powerful way of neutralizing misinformation. And the most interesting thing I found in that research is that explaining the techniques of misinformation in one area often conveys resistance or resilience or immunizes people against the same techniques across a range of different topics. Logic and critical thinking is like a universal vaccine against misinformation. And I'll touch on that during my talk. But just two caveats then about what I'll be talking about. Firstly, while the Debunking Handbook and the Conspiracy Theory Handbook are both really about addressing misinformation across any topic, and we've drawn from a whole range of research, the purpose of both handbooks was to take all the available psychological and scientific research into debunking and conspiracy theories and make it accessible, make it practical for people. The examples that I'll be using in my talk tend to be drawn from my own field, which is climate misinformation, but the general principles that I'm talking about and the general best practices apply across all topics. So don't be put off if I am talking about a climate example and you're more interested in misinformation in politics or a different field of science or a different topic. So let me share my slides. You can see those all okay? Great. Now, so I'm going to talk first about the Debunking Handbook. And let me first give credit to all the co-authors of this handbook. I was just one of 24 co-authors. This was written by 24 leading researchers into misinformation and debunking. So it's quite an ambitious consensus document bringing together research from across this field. And then I'll talk about the Conspiracy Theory Handbook afterwards. So let me just go through the major points of the Debunking Handbook and what are some of the practical, I guess, guidelines for anyone who is engaging with and responding to misinformation. The first thing is, in order to effectively respond to misinformation, we need to understand how exactly misinformation does damage. And misinformation can do damage in a number of different ways. And I'll give you a few examples from the climate area. Firstly, misinformation can cause people to believe wrong things. Within climate change, there's overwhelming scientific consensus that humans are causing global warming. A number of studies have found 97% consensus amongst publishing climate scientists. But when you ask the general public how many climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming, the average answer is around 67%. There's a big gap between public perception and the actual 97%. And a big contributor to this consensus gap is misinformation. It's caused people to think that there's active disagreement within the scientific community. This has been a key focus of misinformation about climate change. So causing people to believe wrong things is kind of the most direct, obvious thing that you think misinformation would do damage. But it's actually, I think there are even more dangerous and insidious elements of misinformation. Another thing that misinformation does is it polarizes the public. We've seen over 2 decades of misinformation about climate change that the public are getting further and further apart on this issue. This effect is the strongest on climate change, at least in the US. The US is the most polarized country in the world on climate change, unfortunately. And while this dynamic of polarization also applies to science in general, the US public have also seen a increasing polarization on trust in science. And so while polarization is a big concern, I think just as concerning or possibly even more concerning is the decrease in trust in science and in institutions. And so that's another effect that misinformation has. It erodes trust in institutions. And this can be a very dangerous trend. We've seen that this year when the public distrusts medical experts. That can cause them to behave in ways that puts themselves and their communities in danger. If they fail to wear a mask or social distance or do the other behavioral recommendations of epidemiologists, then you see adverse health impacts amongst the general public. So eroding trust is another dangerous aspect of misinformation. The second point I wanted to make, and that we make in the Debunking Handbook, is that misinformation is sticky. Once it gets in there, once people start believing it, it's really hard to dislodge it. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of thought and design into developing interventions that dislodge the misinformation. And let me give you an example of some research that found it. The seminal research on the stickiness of misinformation was a 2002 paper by Colleen Seifert. And what she did was she showed people an account of a warehouse fire, and then she retracted it. In the account of the warehouse fire, she described how the fire was started. I think it was by cans of gas. And then she went on to retract it and said, actually, there were no cans of gas in the warehouse fire. But she found that people still believed the original cause of the fire. Even if they accepted and remembered the retraction, they still continued to be influenced by that original misinformation. And what was happening with people in this kind of situation is it's helpful to understand what's happening under the hood when you try to correct misinformation. We all build mental models of how the world works. And our mental models are filled with all these different interconnected things. A causes B, B causes C. But what happens if B is a myth, and then you tell people, that thing in your mental model, B, that's actually not true, it's misinformation. What you've done is you've created a gap in people's mental models. And people don't like mental models. They actually prefer a more complete mental model, that's inaccurate compared to a incomplete model with gaps that's more accurate. And so what Seifert found was if you told people actually that the warehouse fire wasn't caused by that, and it creates this gap, but then she found that afterwards, they still continued to be influenced by that original misinformation, that explanation of the fire cause. And she called this the continued influence effect, the fact that people don't like gaps in their mental models. So the implication of this, and one of the most important things that you can do when you're debunking misinformation, is not just explain that the misinformation is wrong. You also need to replace the misinformation with a replacement fact. You need to identify what is that key fact that slots into a person's mental model and replaces the gap or fills the gap that was created by taking away the myth. Other researchers found the same dynamic. For example, they've done experiments where they have a mock trial and you have a suspect who's accused of a crime, and they found that if they provided all the evidence exonerating the suspect and proving that the suspect didn't commit the crime, people still thought, well, maybe he did do the crime. But if they provided all the evidence that they didn't do the crime and an alternative suspect, then they mentally exonerated the original suspect. So it was about taking that original suspect, taking them out of their mental model, but then replacing them with an alternative or replacement suspect. It's the same in any explanation. People have an understanding of how the world works. And if you're telling them part of that explanation is wrong, you need to fill any gaps with a replacement fact. I'll give you an example from climate change. Often climate deniers will propose other explanations for what's causing global warming. They'll say the sun is causing global warming. And commonly scientists will respond by saying, well, we know that the sun can't be causing global warming because solar activity has been going down over the last 50 years while global warming has been, while global temperatures have been going up. And so the sun would actually be having a cooling effect. So that disproves that the sun is causing global warming. And so that's taking the sun out of their mental model, but you then need to fill it with the actual cause of global warming. But then you need to explain, well, actually, we see many lines of evidence that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels is the predominant cause of global warming. And so you're dislodging that original myth with a replacement fact. And I guess if there's one thing that I would want you to take away from this presentation, it's just these 6 words. The most effective thing to do to dislodge, to neutralize misinformation is replace it with a replacement fact. And it's not enough just to explain the facts either. Myths are sticky. They grab people's attention, they're memorable, they're usually very simple and attractive people to understand, and they often evoke an emotional response. So they grab people's attention and stick in their memory. It's very challenging for science communicators and journalists and anyone who's trying to explain an accurate reality. But what you need to do is try to make the facts that you communicate just as sticky as the misinformation that you're dislodging. So that means trying to explain your facts in a simple way. That doesn't mean oversimplify, but it means boiling your factual explanation down to the core truth, the core element of the facts that you're trying to explain, making it concrete rather than abstract. And there's a range of different elements of sticky messaging, and I can come back to that during the Q&A if people are interested. Even if you do identify your replacement fact and you communicate it in a sticky way, you're only halfway there. You kind of got half the job done. So it is important to, and it's the most important thing, is dislodge the myth with a sticky fact. But there is one other important thing you need to do, and I want to explain some research that illustrates this. There was an experiment conducted by Sander van der Linden. It was published in 2017. And what he did was he presented conflicting pieces of information to people. One was this misinformation, which is a website called the Global Warming Petition Project. And it features a list of 31,000 Americans who got a science degree, and they've all signed a petition stating that humans aren't disrupting climate. And the point of this website is to argue that there's no scientific consensus that humans are causing global warming. What the experiment did was it showed people either a fact, and the fact was that there was 97% consensus amongst climate scientists, the myth, the Global Warming Petition Project, or both. So the first bar shows what happens when people are shown just the fact. If you give people the facts, what they found was a strong positive effect. So facts do work. Explaining facts, it's reassuring to know, does have a positive effect on people. The second bar here shows what happened when people were shown just the misinformation, and there was a significant negative effect. So misinformation works. It does reduce people's accurate beliefs. The third group here was shown both the fact, the 97% consensus, and the myth, the Global Warming Petition Project. And what they found was the two cancelled each other out. So the 97% consensus is one of the most effective messages about climate change. It's a sticky message. It's simple, it's concrete, it's memorable. But even that sticky message can be cancelled out by the misinformation. And this is really the fourth and arguably the most important way that misinformation does damage. Misinformation can cancel out facts. It doesn't necessarily have to, a myth doesn't have to be convincing or based on evidence or coherent. It just has to exist. And then that can cancel out the negative, cancel out the positive effect that your facts, your scientific explanations, your accurate information might have. And so that means that even if we do invest all the time and effort to identify our replacement fact and communicate it in a sticky, effective way using best practices and trying to communicate as effectively as possible, all that good effort can be cancelled out by misinformation. And to me, this underscores more than any other way that I've been talking about damage by misinformation. It underscores the fact that we can't ignore misinformation. If we want to just say, I'm just going to concentrate on explaining the facts and doing it well, your efforts can still be cancelled out by misinformation. So we have to acknowledge and recognize the existence of misinformation and come up with strategies to be able to neutralize them. And so in this research, let me just, I got myself out of whack here. And the reason why misinformation is so damaging is because the general public are a lot like Mr. Spock in this Star Trek episode.
That's Garth. Stun him. Hold his Spock. That's Garth.
So when the public are presented with fact and myth, and if they can't tell the difference between the two, the danger is they disengage. And the reason why they disengage is because they can't resolve the conflict between fact and myth. And so while that, I think, explains the most insidious and dangerous element of misinformation, it also points to the solution to misinformation. We need to help people be able to resolve the conflict between fact and myth. If they're presented with conflicting pieces of information, they need the tools to be able to tell which is fact and which is myth. So how do we do that? How do we help people resolve the conflict between fact and myth? In the research, this experiment by Sander van der Linden, he drew upon a branch of psychological research called inoculation theory. And this research takes the idea of vaccination and applies it to knowledge. What inoculation theory researchers have found for over 70 years of research is that if you expose people to a weakened form of misinformation, that builds up their immunity, their resilience, so that when they encounter the actual misinformation, they have become immunized. They are no longer vulnerable to being misled. So what do I mean by a weakened form of misinformation? Basically, there are two elements to an inoculating message. Firstly, warning people of the threat that they might be misled. And secondly, providing counter arguments that explain the rhetorical techniques or the logical fallacies in the misinformation. In the experiment, Sander van der Linden showed this inoculating message to people. This is just an excerpt of the inoculation. And what it did was it explained 3 of the different ways that the misinformation misled. It was an online petition, so there was a lot of fake names. 31,000 seems like a lot, but there were millions of science graduates in the US, so it's only 0.3% of the total scientific community. And thirdly, because it was anyone with a science degree, it was people who had degrees in computer science, agricultural science, medical science, veterinary science, but very few actual climate scientists. Only 0.1% of the signatories were actual climate experts. What the research found was that when you inoculated people before showing them the misinformation was mostly neutralized and the facts were able to have a positive effect again. And so this is just one of many studies that have shown that inoculating people and explaining the techniques of misinformation is effective in neutralizing the misinformation. So how do you inoculate? How do you build public resilience against misinformation? I'll get into this later when we talk about the conspiracy theory handbook, but one way is by explaining the rhetorical techniques used in misinformation. And a framework that I've found very useful is the 5 characteristics of science denial, FLIC. FLIC is just the acronym we use. When we translate to other languages, it gets problematic. I think in German it's PLEV. And yeah, so it's tricky. But FLIC stands for fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. I think I'm going a little long, so I might just sort of we can go into detail in the Q&A if people want more details. But again, this is just the tip of the iceberg too. These are just the 5 categories of rhetorical techniques. And underneath that, there is a whole taxonomy of different types of fallacies, different types of cherry picking, and also 7 different traits of conspiratorial thinking. And I will get into more detail in the conspiratorial thinking when we talk about the conspiracy theory handbook later on. So bringing this all together, this is what we recommend in the debunking handbook is an optimal structure for debunking misinformation. Lead with the facts, put the emphasis on that replacement fact. You do need to mention the myth in order for people to tag it as false in their minds. So there is talk about, can you debunk a myth without mentioning it? And a lot of that talk is based on fear of backfire effects. Fear that by mentioning myths, you might actually reinforce the myth and end up having your debunking backfire and have people believe the myth even more after reading your debunking. Over the last decade, there's been a lot of research into backfire effects, and researchers have struggled to find backfire effects across a whole range of different topics. And so one of the conclusions of the debunking handbook is backfire effects are not the boogeyman that a lot of people make them out to be. And they're very elusive. They're probably not going to happen. And it is a much greater danger to leave misinformation unchallenged. So our recommendation is don't be put off by the fear of backfire effects. It is really important that we do engage with and attempt to neutralize misinformation. The first 2 elements here, fact and myth, these are conflicting pieces of information. So what you want to do next is resolve the conflict between fact and myth by explaining the fallacy that the myth uses to distort the facts. And lastly, finish again with the fact. You want people to remember your replacement fact. So start with it, end with it, make your debunking a fact sandwich, which is a very clumsy phrase that we use to try to communicate the idea of putting the emphasis on the facts. So that was all I wanted to say about the debunking handbook. And I'm happy to answer questions before we move on to talk about the conspiracy theory handbook.
Right. Thank you very much, John. And so please, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. I think that's going to be the best way to go ahead with that, or you can use the Q&A section. So please. And maybe before there are the questions from the participants, let me ask some question that I'm interested in. Could you, John, maybe give us like some tips on how specifically maybe journalists or newsrooms could engage in this type of debunking, right? How the inoculation theory could look like in the hands of journalists who do have some reach on audiences, but they might not have reached towards the audiences that, let's say, really need it, right? So in the handbook, you are mentioning that it's really important to distinguish the target audiences. Maybe some of them are not that prone to disinformation, some are. Do you have any tips on how the journalists could engage in this?
Yeah, so I think the first tip I would give is if possible, when you are fact checking, use the fact as your headline rather than the myth. And sometimes all people will see is the headline, particularly the way social media works today. Often the headline is used as the Facebook post or the tweet. And so you don't want to have the myth as your headline, and that is all that people see. They might not even go and read your article. That so often happens with media articles. So the general principle is try to put well, firstly, identify that replacement fact, try to communicate it in a way that is simple, sticky, compelling, engaging, and then structure your article so that it is emphasizing that fact. In the headline, lead with the fact and end with the fact. But then in the middle of your article, do explain how that misinformation distorts the facts. Because think of it this way, people need to understand, why does this myth exist, or how can this myth exist? And you need to either explain where the myth came from, or what is the motive of the people promoting the misinformation, or maybe all these things, or how the myth distorts the facts. Because people need to think, well, you're saying this and they're saying that. How can two people be saying this? If you say, well, the reason why they're saying that is because they're cherry picking, or it's a false dichotomy, or they're using this fallacy, then people will think, right, I can see exactly what they're doing now and how that fits in with the facts. The fact, myth, fallacy, fact structure is extremely versatile. And I've used it in a whole range of different contexts. I've used it for little short infographics for posting on social media. I've written a college textbook where every chapter was a different aspect of climate science. And so every chapter started by explaining the facts of the climate science, but then we looked at a related myth. And then we explained the fallacy of the myth, and then we came back to the climate science again. So again, every chapter was fact, myth, fallacy, fact. We've produced a online, a MOOC, a massive open online course about climate misinformation. And this was filled with a whole range, like about 50 different 7-minute videos, and every video was fact, myth, fallacy. It was using that same structure. So I know that in the media there is that kind of, they have their own structure where you start with the most important thing you want people to take away, and then it kind of gets less and less important as you go further down the article. I think that it is possible to still do fact, myth, fallacy in a way that's consistent with the media norm, because as long as you recognize that the most important thing that you start your article with is that replacement fact. One other thing I'll say, it is not sufficient in debunking misinformation to just say the myth is not true, or it's not sufficient just to say not myth, because people need to know why not myth. They need to know why the myth is wrong, or why the myth exists, where it came from. So saying not true is inadequate if you want to effectively debunk misinformation.
All right, thank you very much, John. We have some questions in the chat. So Olga is asking what to do to avoid the boomerang effect. I'm not sure what do you mean by the boomerang effect. Feel free to expand in the chat, Olga. I think it could be two things. One is the kind of backfire effect that you already mentioned, John. How to avoid that people, once presented with the debunk or with the fact check, actually kind of tend to believe it even more, or see it as an attack on their own worldview or values. And the second perspective I can think about this boomerang effect is how to avoid the fact that after you might be successful in debunking, but after some time, people, because of these kind of mindset, kind of need to fill in the space, the gap in their minds, and so they return back to to the original myth. So is it about like repeated fact checking, debunking? Do you have any thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, so the first thing you said is the boomerang effect or backfire effect. Like if a debunking threatens a person's worldview. The second thing you're describing is the continued influence effect, which is something else. It's more just continued influence is really just really hard to completely remove the myth. Kind of like it's like weeding a garden. You pull the weeds out and then they grow back again. That's a different kind of dynamic to backfire effects. So yes, a boomerang effect and a backfire effect are just different terms for the same phenomenon. I actually kind of wish back when we wrote the first debunking handbook in 2011, we called them backfire effects, but myself being from Australia, I wish that we had called them boomerang effects, and then that might have become a more common term for it, but that's water under the bridge. So there are actually a number of different types of backfire effects, and the two main ones are the familiarity backfire effect and the worldview backfire effect. The worldview backfire effect is when you debunk misinformation that, and the debunking threatens a person's worldview. For example, there was a really interesting study in the 1950s where a person recruited, I think it was like a group of teenage Christians, and then they presented information debunking their faith, saying, we have found the bones of Christ, and it proves that he didn't rise from the dead. Like he completely made it up, but he was just messing with these kids' heads. And I don't think it would be possible to get ethics approval for that experiment in this day and age. But back in the 1950s, I guess it was the Wild West and researchers could do anything. But so it's kind of amusing in how kind of shocking the research was. But what he found was communicating this message that your faith is wrong and here's the proof, here are the bones. It actually backfired, and the teenagers actually became stronger in their faith. So here was a debunking, threatening their worldview, their religious beliefs, and it actually strengthened their religious beliefs. And there is some examples of the worldview backfire effect in cases such as climate change and religious beliefs. With climate change, the ideology is more political ideology. But I think the important thing to recognize in the case of the worldview backfire effect is it's very elusive. There are very few, like when researchers have tried to replicate this effect, usually they don't find it happening. It happens very rarely. Similarly, with the familiarity backfire effect, the idea here is that by debunking the myth, you're mentioning the myth, and that makes people more familiar with it. And the more familiar we are with a piece of any information, whether it's information or misinformation, the more likely we are to believe that it's true. And so there was some research published in 2007 by Norbert Schwartz and his colleagues that found that when they debunked a myth, but they put the emphasis on the myth and the fact check started with the myth as the headline, they found that amongst older participants whose, I guess, memory is not as strong, over time, all the details of the rebuttal faded and all they remembered was the headline and the myth. And so they ended up believing the myth more than before they saw the debunking. So in that sense, there was a familiarity backfire effect, and the debunking reinforced the myth. The problem is, again, that research hasn't replicated. A number of colleagues, including Ulrich Ecker, who is a co-author of the Debunking Handbook, have tried and tried and tried to replicate the familiarity backfire effect and haven't been able to. And so this is why in the Debunking Handbook, we conclude that do not let fear of a debunking of a backfire effect dissuade you from engaging with misinformation and debunking it. That said, there are some things that you can do to minimize well, not necessarily a backfire, but at least make sure that your debunking is as effective as possible. One thing is, before you mention a myth in a debunking, explicitly warn people that you're about to mention the myth. So, I mean, that can be as simple as one myth is that, and then you mention the myth. So you've warned them, I'm about to mention a myth. Another way is, if you, depending on the format of your debunking, just use visual cues. Put a little badge next to the myth, like a little red box, or put the myth in a red box. You know, those kind of visual cues can let people know that this is misinformation. And what that does is it puts people cognitively on guard, so that they're less likely to be influenced by the myth or encoded in their memories as a true statement. And similarly with the worldview backfire effect, or while there's not really much danger of a backfire, there is still the danger that your debunking will be ineffective, because people whose worldview is threatened will just ignore it. So if you can frame your debunking in a way that doesn't threaten people's worldview, and ideally even affirms their worldview, then you increase the chances of your debunking being more effective. And some ways that you can do that is selecting messengers who belong to the audience community, who share the same values. So we found that in the US, for instance, where climate change is so polarized and tribal, the most effective messengers are political conservatives who share the values of the audience that they're speaking to. Or if someone's speaking to a Christian group, having Christians from within that community talking to them about climate change is more effective than bringing someone from outside of that community who doesn't share their values, speaks a different vocabulary and doesn't relate to them. So yeah, so finding people who share their values and can talk about the issue in a way that affirms rather than threatens their worldview is a way to maximize the effectiveness of your rebuttal.
Thank you very much, John. Let's go just quickly through some of the remaining questions. If you can give us an example of the impossible expectations part of the Flick diagram.
Yeah, so
what would that be?
The tobacco industry really pioneered this technique back in the mid 20th century. They were desperate to prevent legislation that regulated smoking, and the justification for regulating smoking was all the health impacts. You know, smoking causes cancer, it's addictive. There's all these health negative effects. And so what the tobacco industry did was they kept trying to raise the level of proof that smoking caused health impacts. And by raising the level of scientific proof to these impossible, unrealistic standards or impossible expectations, it was really just a way to delay regulation of the industry. We now see it with climate change, where climate deniers will attack climate models for not perfectly matching the temperature record, and they're not meant to. They provide a range of values. They'll often say, if you can't tell me exactly what the climate model can't tell me exactly what the temperature is going to be, then how can you trust it? And similarly, it's just in general in science. Science doesn't provide exact values. It always provides an estimated range of values, and so often that public confusion about what science does is exploited by science deniers by saying, if you can't provide an exact value, then you don't really know what's going on. You're saying it's either this or this. You know, become more exact before we should do anything. And always the goal is delaying action or delaying public support.
Thank you. And there's one more question that I will bring up from the chat from Alexis, but we'll keep it open. Alexis is asking if you, John, or we at Transitions have some fact sheets on COVID-19 that include these fact, myth, and fallacy elements. or if we can recommend some online resources. Let's leave this open because, as I said, this is just the first part of a course series. So I take it
Yeah.
as my homework to prepare the list of resources that we'll share with you as a part of the course. John, please, if you can think about it and share with me some of the links or examples that you can think of. It can be in the area of COVID, but definitely if there's something that you think would be useful from the area of climate change, we will put it as a list of resources.
Very quickly, I will point you to the following URL, sks.to/covideos. So it's COVIDEOS, as in COVID videos, co-videos. So what this is a series of videos I've produced that basically takes this critical thinking approach, explaining the fallacies and rhetorical techniques in misinformation, and applies it to some of the most common myths about COVID. Again, it's very US focused. I've been grabbing a lot of video clips of, for example, President Trump and people in his administration who have been promoting a lot of COVID misinformation. But generally, I've been taking the approach that I apply in climate misinformation, using critical thinking and inoculation, and applying it to COVID misinformation as a way of just explaining common science denial techniques.
Thank you very much. Please, if you can type the link into the chat, because I'm not sure if I spelled it correctly. So just to make sure that we have it.
Oops, no, I got it wrong. Let me try again. There we go.
All right. Thank you very much, and we'll add it to the resources list for the upcoming course. Okay, John, please go ahead, sharing your screen and slides again. We're a little delayed, but that's fine. Please, let's go with the conspiracy theories.
Will do. All right. So earlier this year, actually it was late last year, in December 2019, Stefan Lewandowski and I began writing the Conspiracy Theory Handbook. And so this was well before the pandemic. What we basically wanted to do was replicate what we'd done with the Debunking Handbook, with the Consensus Handbook, and Steve had already written the Uncertainty Handbook. And the approach we took with all these handbooks was take all the scientific research, which is usually, the average person doesn't read all the scientific papers. And often the papers are paywalled and hard for the general public to access anyway. And so what we want to do is take all this research, boil it down to the key facts, the key findings, and most importantly, recommendations for practical implementation. And so over the course of like January, February in 2020, we wrote the handbook and we had it ready to go. And then the pandemic hit. And shortly after the pandemic struck, the conspiracy theories just exploded. And so while we were planning to release the handbook in the middle of the year, when I was going to be traveling to England and visit Stefan Lewandowski in Bristol, we decided just to publish it as quickly as possible, I think in around April. And it really struck a nerve because people were looking for evidence-based, science-based ways of responding to conspiracy theories. And so what we did in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook was really explain conspiracy theories, how they work, why they're popular, and then how to respond to them. And so in explaining why conspiracy theories are so popular, I'll just go through a few of those reasons, and then you'll see why they've exploded in 2020. When people feel powerless, when they feel vulnerable, when they feel threatened, conspiracy theories are a way for people to basically psychologically feel more in control of the situation. And so this is particularly the case when they feel threatened by something random. People don't like randomness. Earlier, I was talking about how people don't like gaps in their knowledge. Kind of a similar dynamic, but people also don't like the notion that random events are sweeping across them and control their lives. We actually prefer the notion that a conspiracy is controlling the world compared to just random events. People seem to be more comfortable with Bill Gates trying to inject a microchip in every person on the planet compared to the random notion that a virus mutated from a bat into another creature, into a wet market, and then just randomly spread across the world. They prefer that there is agency and control rather than randomness. Conspiracy theories are also usually simple. They involve a narrative. They involve a villain. They're a story, and we think in stories. And so stories are very compelling, particularly if they're simple, if they're sticky. And so they're quite powerful in explaining unlikely events, particularly when the actual explanation is really complicated. This is that dynamic of fight sticky myths with sticky facts. If the facts are really complicated and the myth or the conspiracy theory is really simple, it's an unequal playing field, and people are psychologically attracted to the simpler explanation. Simple can often be more convincing. And lastly, conspiracy theories are useful for disputing mainstream science, mainstream politics, or just mainstream narratives or explanations of the world. And I'll give you an example of that. In climate change, when researchers asked people to respond to just facts about global warming, they found that conspiratorial thinking was the biggest response by far in response to climate change by people who denied climate science. If you deny a scientific consensus, it's almost automatic that you're also going to subscribe to conspiracy theories to explain why the global community of scientists disagree with you. And one interesting dynamic this year has been that all the same people who deny climate change are also COVID deniers. They're the ones who are promoting COVID misinformation. Once you start going down that rabbit hole of questioning mainstream science or questioning institutions, questioning governments, then you're more fertile ground for questioning mainstream science in other fields as well. These conspiratorial thought patterns make you more predisposed to believe conspiracy theories in a different area. So survey research has shown that conspiracy theories tend to cluster. People who believe one conspiracy theory tend to believe other conspiracy theories as well, even on completely unrelated topics. That said, there are real conspiracies in the world. So one of the things we do in the conspiracy theory handbook is explore this notion of how do you tell the difference between a real conspiracy and a baseless conspiracy theory. And the solution that we provide, that we propose, is that there are certain traits to actual conspiracies that have been exposed in the world. The tobacco industry were convicted of conspiracy to deceive the public. Volkswagen conspired to deceive the public about the level of pollution that their cars emitted. So there have been real conspiracies, but the ways that they've been uncovered does not look like what conspiracy theorists look like. In the case of real conspiracies, they've been uncovered by healthy skepticism in contrast to overriding suspicion. So it is being skeptical, but not being disbelieving of all information. It's just question it, but don't automatically deny any scientific evidence that conflicts with your beliefs. Along those lines, healthy thinking or mainstream thinking is responsive to evidence. So if you encounter evidence that contradicts your beliefs, you're more responsive to changing your beliefs, whereas a conspiracy theorist is immune to evidence. And if you provide any evidence that disproves their conspiracy theory, they usually respond by reinterpreting that evidence as being part of the conspiracy theory. So they expand their theory so that wherever that evidence came from was part of the conspiracy as well. And lastly, conventional thinking strives for coherence. We try to build an explanation of the world where everything is consistent with each other. But conspiracy theorists often have contradictory beliefs. They, because they're so committed to disbelieving the mainstream account, they will accept any explanation that disproves the mainstream account. And so two different things contradict each other, but as long as they both contradict the mainstream account, they're more attracted to believing both of them. And so, so we have these traits of conventional thinking, and then we have these telltale red flags of conspiratorial thinking. And so that leads us to the next stage of the conspiracy theory handbook, which is identifying the traits of conspiratorial thinking. Being aware of these different traits is a way of spotting the red flags that what you're looking at is more likely to be a baseless conspiracy theory. So if you see some of these traits in information that you're encountering, that's a red flag to look a little closer and think, well, seeing some of these traits increases the likelihood that this might be a conspiracy theory rather than an accurate explanation of the world. And again, I'm happy to get into more detail of the 7 traits. But I already have looked at a few of them. Overriding suspicion, I think, is an important one. If someone displays deep suspicion of institutional data, such as epidemiological data from the World Health Organization, or climate data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you know, these international institutions, that's a red flag that the person is a conspiracy theorist rather than displaying healthy skepticism. And similarly, reinterpreting randomness is a telltale red flag of conspiracy theorists. Examples of that is just taking 2 random things and drawing a causal link between them. There is a virus lab in Wuhan, and COVID started in Wuhan. Well, that can't be a coincidence. And they draw a link between the 2 and say, well, obviously that lab must have engineered the virus. Similarly, they'll say COVID started in 2019, and 5G came out in 2019. Well, that can't be a coincidence. 5G must have caused COVID. A lot of things happened in 2019. Baby Yoda came out in 2019, but he didn't start COVID. Well, at least I hope not. And so when people are just joining links between these random things, that's a red flag of a conspiracy theorist. So most important, how do we respond to conspiracy theories? Because our work has focused on inoculation and preemptively trying to stop the damage before it happens, we talk a bit about preemptive ways of trying to prevent conspiracy theories from taking hold in people. And there are a couple of things that you can do to try to minimize the impact or damage that conspiracy theories has. One is promoting media literacy, and this applies to misinformation in general. By media literacy, I mean giving people tools to assess information sources. When they see information, assessing, well, where did that come from? Are there any red flags of fake news or conspiracy theories in that information? Is the informational source a reliable one? And just being able to go through those steps of assessing articles that they might see in media or headlines or posts they might see on social media and trying to assess the relative credibility of posts. Secondly, we recommend inoculation, and this is the same technique that I talked about in the debunking handbook, which is explaining the techniques of misinformation. In the case of conspiracy theories, it's about explaining those 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking. By raising people's awareness of these 7 traits, that helps them spot these red flags, so that when they see a post on social media and they see that there's overriding suspicion or reinterpreting randomness or other red flags, that puts them on alert to be, and immunizes them against being misled by the conspiracy theory. And thirdly, empowering people can help reduce their vulnerability to being influenced by conspiracy theories. If what puts people into this state of being vulnerable to conspiracy theories is feeling vulnerable, feeling threatened, feeling disempowered, then research has shown that empowering people so that they are less vulnerable to influence is a way of reducing conspiracy theories' influence. And one example is emphasizing and communicating procedural justice, as in explaining to people that that systems are fair, hopefully in a case where systems are actually fair. And we're seeing that happen right now in the US. Our country right now is being swarmed with conspiracy theories about the election, and the way to respond to those is emphasizing the rigor in the election process here. Like it actually, because there was a lot of concern about the integrity of the US election, there were a lot of procedures put into place to ensure that votes were counted fairly and accurately, with poll watchers and multiple steps to ensure integrity. And so trying to preemptively explain to people these procedures and show how fair the system is a way of reducing the effect of these conspiracy theories. It's never going to get rid of them. Conspiracy theorists are going to believe what they believe, and it's very hard to change the mind of a conspiracy theorist. And one of the reasons why is because of that immunity to evidence. But you can stop or reduce the spread of conspiracy theories by inoculating the rest of the public. So while preemptive inoculation is, I think, the most effective strategy in stopping the spread of conspiracy theories, people still want to know, well, how do you talk to a conspiracy theorist? Like, well, what do you do to try to undo the damage once the conspiracy theories are out there? And there really are 3 forms of inoculation or correction. And I've alluded to these in the debunking handbook already, but they I'll just go over them in a more systematic way now. The 3 forms of correction are fact-based, logic-based, and source-based. Fact-based involves explaining the facts to explain how the misinformation is wrong, or to explain how the conspiracy theory is wrong. An example is birtherism in the US, the conspiracy theory that, or the misinformation that President Obama was not born in the US, but was born in Kenya or in Africa or Malaysia. I forget where the conspiracy theory claimed. But the explaining the facts, which was providing evidence that Obama was born in Hawaii, providing birth certificates, providing all the information that falsified the misinformation, is one way of correcting a conspiracy theory. Logic-based is explaining the techniques of misinformation or conspiracy theories. So that can be explaining logical fallacies, rhetorical techniques, or the traits of conspiratorial thinking. And the third way is source-based corrections. And that's really involves reducing the credibility of the misinformation source. And that can involve either explaining the motives of the misinformation source. Maybe they have ideological motives, maybe they have profit motives, or it could be showing their poor track record in the past and how they have promoted misinformation in the past that was obviously shown to be false. And sometimes it could be as simple as ridiculing the implausibility of their misinformation. And so in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook, we talk about research that found that just ridiculing conspiracy theories about lizard men was effective in reducing that conspiracy theory by showing in explicit ways just how ridiculous the notion is that lizard men are walking amongst us. And they found that that was a more effective way of reducing that conspiracy theory than other forms of inoculation. And lastly, if you do need to talk to a conspiracy theorist, for example, you might have a family member or a friend who believes a certain conspiracy theory, how you approach that. Firstly, I think it's important to recognize that your odds of actually changing a conspiracy theorist is very small because of that trait of immunity to evidence. So dial down your expectations, otherwise you get too frustrated and can get quite angry, and that's not productive. And so if you are directly engaging, while I was talking about source-based correction before, in the context of having a conversation with a person, avoiding ridicule is important. If you are making fun of a person while trying to change their mind, you have zero chances of success. So that's kind of the first most obvious thing. People who belong to that community, again, we were talking about this before with the worldview backfire effect. Those are the best messengers for trying to reach a community. And so it's often the person who used to believe a conspiracy theory but then change their mind can be the most effective messenger to try to outreach to a conspiratorial community. And so because people do think in stories, we remember in stories, and we're very persuaded by stories, it can be a case of telling the story of how a person who believed a conspiracy theory saw their way out, what was the path they went through to realize that the conspiracy theory was baseless, and eventually they came to see it as false. So that is one potential way of reaching people like conspiracy theorists. But lastly, the last 2 points, empathy and critical thinking, I think are a potential strategy. I will give you the qualifier that I personally have never been able to, in conversation, change the mind of a conspiracy theorist. So on these last 2 points, I'm really talking from the research, not from personal experience. But some research has shown that showing empathy and appealing to common values can be effective in talking to a conspiracy theorist, particularly the common value of critical thinking. Conspiracy theorists like to think of themselves as critical thinkers. They're not gullible. They're not like other sheeple. They haven't been taken in by the government account. They're critical thinkers. So appealing to that value of critical thinking is a way to potentially challenge a conspiracy theorist to apply that critical thinking to their own conspiracy theory. And it's a long shot, but there is a potential that you can help them see how it's incoherent, how it's not based on evidence, how it's implausible that that conspiracy theory could actually take place. When you think through the implications, well, if all the X thousand people are in on this, then that has downstream implications, which are usually highly, highly implausible. So so that's the Conspiracy Theory Handbook. And the two are really a package, and they're really based on a common body of research. which is that building public resilience is a very fruitful strategy in countering misinformation. So explaining the facts is useful, but also explaining the techniques of misinformation and conspiracy theories has much broader application and can work across issues. And so that's why we recommend that as a potential strategy. So on that, I think I'll just redirect you to a couple of URLs. I mentioned co-videos as my COVID critical thinking videos. I also have Climate Vids, which takes that same approach of critical thinking and inoculation and applies it to climate misinformation. And one last URL I'll direct you to, just a quick personal plug. I apply all this research in a very practical way on crankyuncle.com, where I use critical thinking, but I apply it using humor and cartoons as a way of engaging the public, trying to make my explanations of critical thinking more sticky. And you can see lots of examples of that at crankyuncle.com, including a smartphone critical thinking game that we have coming out in roughly a few weeks from now. So you can find more information about that at crankyuncle.com. I will stop sharing and be happy to answer any more questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John, for the presentation and for the links. So we'll check out the videos and the Cranky Uncle. Elvira had a question, but actually I think you already answered it in your talk. It was about like how to talk to people who are already in the dark side. So Elvira, unless you have another question, I would say that this is answered. Please, anyone who has any question, please feel free to post it in the chat. We are running out of time, but that's fine. Let's use this opportunity. And in the meantime, let me just conclude, because I think I don't have any more specific questions on you, John, at this moment. And I hope we'll be able to remain in touch for the upcoming course. If we or the participants have any questions or would like to consult something with you, it would be great if we can connect again. And now just to summarize some final notes on what's coming up. So please keep in mind that these handbooks are already being translated into Russian, and we started translating to Bosnian. So in a couple of days it should be available also for your colleagues and partners who might not necessarily be English speakers. Also, this webinar with John will translate and subtitles, so we'll be happy if you can share it again with your colleagues who might not be able to follow it in English, but in the local language they could. There will be a next live webinar next week, which is gonna be covering the solutions journalism perspective. So I highly recommend you to join as well and see a little bit different approach and perspective on how to handle the infodemic and disinformation. You will find all the information on this website that I just shared in the chat. Go to tolleducation.org and you will find more information about this course. Later you will find there also the links to register and sign up. We will also send you all these notes and summaries and links in a follow-up email to this session, because since you registered, we have your contacts. So don't worry, you'll get all the updates and all the important practical information. So, and then there will be the practical workshops later on. And if you will have any questions regarding the course, or if you have any ideas on what should we cover, please do not hesitate to write me at my email, jaroslav.valuch@toll.org. I'm just sharing it in the chat. And my last note is thank you to Central European Initiative that helped us with the funding for this learning course so that it can be free for everyone. All right, I don't see any more questions on John. So John, thank you so much for your work on the handbooks and for sharing your thoughts with us. And we're very much looking forward to remain in touch because the practical guidelines that you provide are extremely useful and that really reaches far beyond just research in this area. So thank you very much, John.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
All right. So everyone, please have a nice evening. And I'm really looking forward and I'm really hoping that you will join our follow-up sessions in these courses. So enjoy the evening and hope to see you soon.